Hey guys! Today I'm going to give you a little tutorial on how to make this card holder out of a small handle bag. I made this one for my 2015 December daily album just as a way to hold all of the Christmas cards that I received, and I just used one of the small handle bags from Starbucks, but you could also use like a gift wrap bag, anything that's about this size. This one is 8 inches by 10 inches, and since I'm using a 6x8 album, I just wanted to make sure that it was that 8-inch width. So if you're using a bigger album, you could use a larger bag, but I found that this size is pretty perfect for Christmas cards. I actually didn't measure it when I made it last year. I just used my largest Christmas card as kind of my reference, and as you can see, that size fits really well in these bags. For this project, you're just going to need a few supplies. I used, obviously, a pair of scissors. I also used my paper cutter, but I think that you could easily do it with scissors. I think I used it one time with the paper cutter, so doing it by hand is just as easy. Also, a pencil, ruler, I'm using a tiny attacher. You could also use a regular stapler. I just like that these are a little smaller and more hidden. A tape runner. I'm using the Elmer's glue runners. I find that they're pretty sticky. It's not the dot kind, it's the strip kind, and it applies a lot like glue, and then just some glue dots as well. And then obviously your small handle bag, and you just need one of these in order to make everything. We're going to use the majority of the bag and the handles, and that's all of it. In addition to that, you may want some embellishments or alphabet letters, that kind of thing, after the fact. But I did all of my embellishing once I had made my pocket. So we'll start off by making the pocket page, and then I can show you some options for embellishments after that. So to make our page, we're going to start with the Starbucks bag. I really love the message that's on the front of this, but since my page is going to go sideways, and since it needs to have that little excess part to fold over, like you can see in this one, we want to make a flap to keep our cards inside. I decided to use the crafted by hand and heart side, which is the front side of the bag, as the back of my page, so that you can get the full view of this message on there without having to obscure it or having to make your page really huge. You could make this the front, you're just going to have to make it a little bit wider. It should still fit in your 6x8 book if that's the size you're working with, but probably just barely, so keep that in mind, that you're measuring the width there as you're deciding what size you want and what portion of the bag you want to include. For the first step, since I decided to use the back, and actually regardless of that, you want to fold down this back flap. They come flattened like this, and we want to just fold that portion down on itself. And then I folded those creased lines back on themselves a couple of times, both that bottom one and this top one. Since we're working with like a thicker craft kind of material, they're going to hold the places that those folds were, but we want to just try and get them back to as flat as possible. So once you've flattened that out and decided which side you want to use, we're going to open up the top part here and take out the handles. The important part about taking out the handles is that because they are attached, I don't know if you can see this super well, but since they're attached onto the bag and onto a portion of the bag that we're going to use, they go all the way down to about, I'd say, a third of the way down. We want to be careful that we're maintaining that structural integrity of the top of the bag. Luckily, these handles here are attached between two pieces of paper. So what we want to do on this guy is just peel the actual handle off of the paper while trying to keep that paper portion on the interior of the bag. And I found the easiest way to do this is if you just peel right down, following that handle down, and really prioritize that. You can get the rest of the paper scraps afterwards, that's not as much of a problem. The important part, like I said, is just making sure we're keeping this paper portion on there so that the bag maintains its strength. Otherwise, there's a really good chance you're going to tear through the front side of the bag, and that's pretty hard to repair. So you want to just take off the handles on both sides, and you're going to end up with this. You want to save these because this is what I use to make the little loops for the back, so just hang on to those, set those aside. And now we have a bag that looks like this. So now that the bag has its handles gone, we can measure the size and start cutting it down. Like I said, last year what I did was just used one of my Christmas cards, and since I have that accessible, I'm just going to use that same card this year to kind of determine what size I want. So we're going to lay it down on there and just kind of gauge where, how much extra space you want to allow. Obviously you don't want it to go right up to the card because the fact that you're going to have stacks of cards will expand the size a little bit, so we want to account for that. So I would say include, obviously I included a little bit on the back because the cards can't slide all the way back to this far edge because of folding and the paper thickness and things like that. So I would say include at least a ½ inch past the size of your card, if that's how you're doing this. If not, I would maybe just measure out like a page protector or something size-wise that you want. But I measured about to that S, and then you want to include a little bit of extra so that we can fold that back on itself, just so you don't have a sharp edge that you could cut yourself on. So mine went to right about where that S is. Looks like it's about, I'd say just over 6 inches was where I wanted to cut it off at. But then you want to include a little bit extra. I would say another 1/4 or ½ inch for the fold over portion there. So I'm just going to go ahead and mark this at 6 1/4 on both sides. And then we're just going to draw a line right across here so that we know where to cut it off at. And then you want to cut right down these side portions here, just right along that closest edge. And you're just going to cut directly down right across where your line is and then right back up the sides. And I've already done that on my other portion here, so I can show you what that kind of looks like in the end. So we're going to end up with something that looks like this. This is the portion that we're cutting off, and it should just form a rectangle like this that we're just going to toss. We don't need this part anymore. So you want to remove that once you have cut that part off, and then just cut down those little slits there of your extra 1/4 inch or whatever you included as your excess for folding, and fold that part down. And now you're left with something that should look like this. From here, what I decided, because I really liked how the interior portion of the sides of the bag looked, I decided I wanted to include these this year. This is obviously only going to show in your fold over flap, but I thought it was a fun addition. So I'm going to include these. This is not a completely necessary step. If you want to skip this, feel free to just cut this whole part off. But I'm going to include this. So to do that, I just cut right down this edge, right where that fold was. So from, again, from that outside part right down, and you only want to cut to that center fold on each side of each of these, and then once you've done that, you can just fold them in like this. Okay, so this is what we should all be working with now, at least something close to this. So you've cut off the sides, you have your front flap open, and we're now going to eliminate some of the sides and the bottom that we have here. So what I did first was just went, again, right along where that fold line already is, and cut down the sides right to where this kind of triangular bottom portion begins. You'll see when you look at this that as you're cutting the insides, I'll get to the right part, you have a line down the center that goes right down to this kind of triangular part. So what we want to do, you've already cut this part off, so where that starts on the middle here, you want to cut right down to the top of that triangle and then cut back on each side. So as you can see, I've sliced down both of my edges here. We cut that portion out on both sides in the triangular shape, and then left some of the bottom of the bag. I found it was easiest to cut down here, cut to the corner there, and then just leave a little flap here on the back side, because this is what we're going to attach our front side to. So again, you're cutting down the side, cutting at an angle. I cut it back at that same angle and then cut right across, leaving about a ½ inch of flap. This could be bigger if you want it to be. I would say definitely not smaller. I almost wish I had left a little more here on mine. So that would be my recommendation, is definitely not smaller than this, because this is going to fold back onto here, and it doesn't matter if this is larger. It does matter if it's smaller, because it's going to make it harder to attach everything together. So that's what your backside should look like. The front side, again, we want to have these flaps that have been cut down the side, again, cut to the angles, and then for the bottom of the bag, which is what this is, it's just really important, again, that we're including that extra so that we can fold that back down. So this is what you should end up with after you've eliminated both of those. So now that we're left with something like this, we can start to assemble the interior of our bag. I just want to show you real quick what the general idea is in case you've made different measurements or included different portions of the bag. So what I want to do is this is actually going to be, again, what the cards are sliding in and out of. So all we really need to do for that part is just attach this section down onto these flaps. We just want to make sure that no glue ends up on the inside of here because we don't want anything for our cards to get stuck on. So I'm just going to attach these sections right here onto these side flaps, again making sure that it doesn't overlap glue-wise onto there. And then we'll be left with a pocket like this. Once we have this, we can then attach that onto this interior portion. The flaps inside of here line up really nicely, so hopefully nothing will get caught when we're doing that, when we're sliding the cards in and out. And those flaps are just going to attach onto each other, creating, hopefully you can see this pocket inside of there. So at this point, I'm going to decide where I want my side flap on the side here to get cut off at, so that then we can start folding everything down. So this is obviously about where my edges are going to line up. Nothing should move around too much from that. So that makes this my fold line here. And since my design cuts off somewhere in the middle there, I think I'm going to cut it off right next to this leaf here. So I'm just going to do that with my paper cutter real quick. Again, you could do that with scissors too if that works better. Whatever you have lying around, this would just be a good opportunity to cut that off. So now I have this as the back, and I have a little bit of flap there to fold over. This is a little larger than my last year's one was. I only added about, I'd say like a 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch on last year's and then made it a little wider with the trim. But again, I just kind of followed where my design cut off naturally and included just enough to hold it closed. It doesn't lay super flat, which is why I've decided to do a little bit more this year in the hopes that having a little more bulk and a little more space maybe where I can add an attacher will help it lay a little flatter in my book this year. So now that I've done that, the next step is you're going to want to cut your little back loops, these guys. I've already done that with one of my top handle bags, but what you want to do is just take one of these guys, cut it off of the paper section there, and then I tried to use the loop that's already in the bag on 2 of the handles. You could just use one if you want to, but I try and use some of that natural curvature that's already built in there as my curve so that it doesn't take extra bending. And then once you have that, you just want to make sure they'll bend over easily. And these guys are about, I would say 2 inches, 1.5 to 2 inches on each side just to be safe. So about 4 to 5 inches overall is what I would cut your pieces down to, because you can always make them shorter, but you don't want them to be too short. We need enough space to attach them into the back there. So what I'm doing now is just gluing down all of my edges here. You want to make sure that you're just gluing right along that outside edge as close as possible so that everything will lay super flat on there. And make sure to not get any adhesive on the interior part where your cards are going to touch. And once that's done, we'll just fold everything back in flat here. And the key is just making sure that everything ends up really flat and flush. Alright, so now that I have the back side, I'm going to attach the loops on the back of mine. I'm going to use this one for reference, but what I used for reference previously was just my binder, or you could use one of the pocket pages too to see where your holes are. So we just want to figure out where those back holes are. And since mine are the same size, luckily it'll line up really nicely here. As you can see, I'm actually going to flip it around so we can see what we're working with. And then this is where your glue dots and your stapler are both going to come into play. I'm going to use these thin glue dots just because it's what I have on hand right now, and put one on each end just to help hold it in place while we put everything together. So sticky. Alright, and then we'll figure out where we want to place these guys. So I think I want my loops a little bit bigger than last year. This is pretty much the smallest you want to go. This sits right next to the binder rings in there, so I'm going to do it a little further out this time. I'm going to say about there. But again, the key is we want to make sure that they're even so that it sits flat in there. So I'm just going to use my glue dots just to squish those and hold them kind of temporarily. They're not going to be our primary source of what's holding those in, but it'll help keep them in place while we assemble everything else around them. Oops, that was a little too far out. Alright. Now that we have our back loops in, we can start assembling the interior of the front side. I'm going to set that aside. So now we just need to finish attaching this part together and then attach it onto here. So what I'm going to do is just glue this back flap down on top of these guys. To do that, I think I'm going to grab a pencil and trace where those lines are just so I know the exact space that I'm working with there. It's not really going to matter if we get glue on this exterior part because it's going to glue down onto the back side, but just so I know, because you really want to get close to those edges so that that's all laying down nice and flush. And then that's where I'm going to put my adhesive, is right up against those pencil lines I made. And then we'll fold that down nice and flush. And now we're going to attach the front side onto the back side here. So how I'm going to do this is just apply some adhesive along these edges. Since we use the sides of the bag that should be pretty equally sized, they should line up right on top of each other. So if we're going just right along both of these edges, that'll help adhere these two sides together and we'll create our pocket. It'll hold those guys down to each other, but again, we want to make sure that this inside portion doesn't get any adhesive on it because that's where our cards are going to slide into and out of. When you get to the back side, just do your best to go over top of these, and then we're also going to staple on top of our little loops to keep them in place as well. So I'm going to apply my adhesive, and now that I've applied adhesive all the way around the edge of my front side, I'm just going to stick that down onto the back side. And you want to line it up with the back and the side edges as much as possible. I found that these bags are not necessarily the same size front and back, so you may want to take that into account. I actually probably should have accounted for that on which side I put my adhesive onto. And we're just going to squish that all down together. Stick our sides down. So now that everything is stuck together, we should end up with something that looks like this. Our insides are all glued down to each other and we have a pocket in there. And now we just want to make sure that we're securing our little loops in there really well, because they have a tendency to move around like they just did. So this is where I'm going to use the tiny attacher. You could use a regular stapler, and I'm just going to staple on the back sides of both of those to keep them in there. You could also choose to just use a heavier glue on the back side there, and not worry about stapling these. They're just so thick that they're tricky to get in there. You could also use ribbons or just punch holes directly in your card if you don't like the look of this. Make sure everybody's stuck down. Yep, looks good. So now we have a pocket. I'm just going to fold these flaps down. I'm going to glue this one down. I'm going to do the same thing on this just so I have a less harsh edge that I'm working with there. Like this. And then the last step is just to decorate. So after looking through my embellishments, I decided to add on this little mini doily to cover up their please reuse recycle message that's on the front. I included that in my last year's album because it was on the back side, but I didn't want it on the front of mine this year. Once I had my edges all folded down and everything glued down and saw this, I realized that I maybe want to wait until I find out where this is going to land in my album to finish decorating it. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to leave it plain like this for now. I may even just leave it like this because I kind of like the simplicity of it. I will say, for me, I'm going to cover up the Starbucks logo that's on the back just by cutting down a piece of paper. I tried to cover this with a doily, but it's too large, so it looks like I'm going to have to cut some paper down to cover up that just so that I can really see the crafted by hand and heart message. But my plans thus far are just for those two things, and we'll see what happens in the future. I'll post comments or post pictures of it on my Instagram probably when I get to the point that this is finished so that everybody can see what I ended up with. And I'd love to see yours as well, so if you make one of these, tag me in it so that I can see your fun embellishment ideas. But now you guys know how to make a Christmas card holder. And like I said, your cards will just slide right into and out of this pocket. I made this one a little bit more roomy than last year, so hopefully more cards can fit in there. And I can't wait to see what you guys make. Thanks so much for following along. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave those below, and I'll try my best to respond to all of them. And I can't wait to see what you make. Thanks for watching.